In 1968, from March 19th to the 23rd, hundreds of Howard University students occupied the university's administration building. It's what we call the A building. The students expressed their frustration with Howard University's president, James Nabrit, and they issued a list of demands. The first was that the president resign. The second was to create a judiciary system to address student discipline. The third was that the university's curriculum must change to emphasize African and African American history and culture. A fourth demand was for amnesty for the student leaders who orchestrated the takeover. The students also rejected the widely held conception and celebration of Howard as the Black Harvard. Their goal was to remake Howard, a university founded in 1867 to educate and create educators, doctors, and nurses for the formerly enslaved Africans into a truly Black university that had a curriculum that centered the global Black experience. And their protests produced change. The creation of the Department of Afro-American Studies, Jazz Studies, the African American Resource Center, the Institute of Arts and Humanities, and the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center, and the resignation of James Nabrit. These student activists were part of Howard's second founding and helped usher in a period in which African Americans were no longer fighting to claim their citizenship, but to define the type of citizens that they would be. In so doing, they demonstrated the power of protest. From MSRC, the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center on the campus of Howard University, I am Dr. Benjamin Talton, and this is On the Yard, a podcast that uses MSRC's archival collections to shape conversations, explore stories, and uncover the ideas that drive change and celebrate the history and culture that define the global Black experience. For this inaugural episode, I'm delighted to be joined by my Howard University colleagues, Dr. Greg Carr, Professor of African American Studies and host of In Class with Carr, and Dr. Dana Williams, Professor of English Literature, Dean of the Graduate School, and most recently author of the book, Tony at Random, The Iconic Writer's Legendary Editorship. Thank you all for joining me, Greg and Dana. I appreciate this.
Appreciate the invitation, Ben.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I began with this narrative that I put together just to lay out some background. What do you think are some issues and events that I might add to that narrative to make it fuller, more complete?
I was struck by your comment that it was the second founding of the university, and then your subsequent comment around it about moving beyond this question of citizenship to like the what now. And Greg and I taught freshman seminar at Howard for many years, and one of the texts that we did was The Education of Black People by Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, and that Johnson C. Smith essay, Whither, Where, and Now, where the question really is like, all right, now that the question of citizenship is air quotes settled, because of course it never has been and probably will never be, what will be our own ideals? Will we adopt American ideals or will we have any of our own? And I think part of what we see coming out of that protest is a real push to have ideals of our own.
Right. Yeah, and I was being a little provocative with second founding. I was hoping you pick up on that. You know,
I did.
Dealing with 1965, the legal question of citizenship has been settled, but the more political, philosophical question of citizenship, I don't think was settled in 65. What do you think, Greg?
Yeah, I think citizenship is the villain of the piece, isn't it? The whole idea of the nation state is problematic. And we know that rights are not mentioned in that regard in the federal constitution. There's a citizenship. There's no citizenship established as constitutional principle to the 14th Amendment, as our colleague Sherilyn Eichel often reminds us.
Absolutely.
And I don't think we were fighting for citizenship. I don't think we ever were. What we're fighting for is to be within our full humanity, hence Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, which says no person shall be deprived of due process of law or equal protection under the law. And I think, to echo what Dana said, that's what Du Bois is after in that 1960 speech at Johnson C. Smith. And I think that relates directly to the impulse to imagine the Black university. I think the university is in crisis now, probably terminal crisis, not Howard. I mean, the university is a concept. And I think that the idea of the Black university that emerged in the mid to late 60s, that you can trace its roots certainly back to Du Bois and those Atlantic University studies in the late 19th or 20th centuries. The trajectory was always to not only include the community, but ultimately center the community. And I think that move in 67 and 68 is really the last major effort to extricate the Black university from the concept of the university generally. And I think there's been a long, slow, but steady and progressively counter-revolutionary trajectory since then.
Yeah, let's get into some of that context because it's important to remember always that because you went back to 67 and we can go back farther. I was reading Zora Neale Hurston's essay on the Durkee presidency. Durkee was the last white president Howard had before Mordecai came in. And she's talking about the protests they had back in the 20s, 23, 24, 25 over the idea that there should be a Black president of a Black university and mandatory chapel attendance and dress codes for women. So protest is part of Howard University's tradition, legacy, and history.
Yep, and militarism.
And militarism. You want to speak on that?
Well, I mean, it's always been a complicated relationship between whether or not to have an ROTC that is sanctioned by university. Like, how do you deal with real-time war when students are being pulled out? But, Hurston was clear, as a number of protests that followed were clear about the complicated relationship Black people had to citizenship and militarism and invasions. And so we see a number of people coming to campus making those kinds of, or having those conversations, which I think is also something that we should appreciate, that they were conversations that were had. It wasn't a yes, no, absolutely, because this kind of contemporary talk about what the university should be and how it should be open for debate, it's disingenuous in some ways.
That's when Greg's talking about the crisis of the university, not just Howard and not just HBCUs, but universities in general. Because if you can't have those debates, then you cease to exist. Isn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting that you mentioned 22 and Zora Hurston, Raymond Walters, who was very accomplished scholar dealing with education in general and HBCUs as well. His politics not set aside for a moment. He's very conservative in many ways in later years, but he wrote a book called, as we all remember, I think it was LSU Press, called The New Negro on Campus, where he talks about those Howard protests in the context of other HBCUs, FAMU, Fisk. And we all remember, of course, Du Bois gives that one of his 4 commencement speeches in that book that Dana and I had the first people read. And he comes in the wake of that protest and like, what's going on in Fisk? You got Black girls down here entertaining these rich guys in downtown Nashville, and we got to get rid of this white president. He runs off. I think it was McKenzie was president of Fisk at the time. But there is a thrust from these students, many of whom are first generation. This is 4 years after World War I. Howard is moving in a trajectory to kind of want to show their patriotism. We get this Veritas et Utilitatis shield, which ultimately replaces the equal rights and knowledge for all logo or shield of Howard. And the students are having it. They are not yet been recruited into kind of a bourgeois class that has more to lose than to gain. And they are indeed the new Negroes. That is the sentiment. So whether it be 22 and then 2 years later, they strike again. They get some joint power. They struck against compulsory military participation, as you say. 20 years later, they're back at it again in the anti-lynching campaign. So every generation, you see this. Although now we are at a point now where I think the class cleavages, the class kind of distinctions that were forestalled by apartheid in this country make that maybe more difficult. It's a different student body now than the 20s and the 40s. And I would argue even the 90s or even the early aughts. It starts looking like demographically, it may look the same, but in terms of posture, the posture may more closely resemble Black students at white schools. This is an interesting moment.
Right. The idea of a shared challenges, shared struggles, it's not as palpable as it was in the past. We don't have that effective glue that binds us together. Racism is not just, it's there. But the sense of it, the perception of it is not as shared as it once was. Even in international affairs, we had the anti-apartheid movement that we could disagree on all sorts of things and be confused about Rwanda and Darfur, but apartheid, we were very clear about where we stood with that.
No, that's excellent. But let me just say, they weren't pushing for the Black American University. You just put the key right on it, right there, brother. They were pushing for the Black University. That's a global concept, and that runs squarely against the sensibility of a lot of universities in this country, including, quite frankly, a lot of HBCUs.
Absolutely. And that's part of the conversation I want to continue to have with this podcast, is that it's not just about Howard or other Black colleges and universities, because all of our institutions are windows into America and windows into the world. And what I'm really proud of Howard about, and Lincoln and Fisk as well, is that it's always been globally Black, right? Since we were founded in in 1867, our first African students were graduating in 1870. So from the very beginning, we've always been global in our blackness, right? Our largest student organization is the African Student Association. We have a Caribbean tree in the center of campus. So we've always been global. So that global, that black is very important on that. We're not just talking about African Americans. But just for context, people may not know that Howard had white presidents until 1926.
Or a white founder. I mean, it was always surprising.
And Howard had a white founder, although
Right.
I used Frederick Douglass as one of our founders because he was the longest serving member of the Board of Trustees, 50 years. But yes, we had a white founder, white presidents until 1926, but as did many of the private HBCUs, right? Or well, HBCUs are kind of a new term. I prefer black colleges, but Morehouse had a white president. Spelman had white presidents, male presidents, I believe. Lincoln and Hampton, of course, obviously. Tuskegee stands out, but some of those that were founded by churches, AMEs and CMEs, had black presidents. But let me throw some precursors to 68 at you and just pick any one of those up or add some that we could just elaborate on, just fleshing out some of this history. So again, this history of protest, it didn't just begin in 68. People might be surprised that law students had to organize, and other students had to organize in order for there to be a homecoming queen that didn't have permed hair. I laugh every time I say that, but you could not be homecoming queen at Howard University. I don't know if it was by a rule, by fiat, if you had the hair that God makes naturally grow out of your head. So they organized, it took them 2 years, I believe. Robin Gregory, 1966, was the first homecoming queen to have the hair that God naturally has grow out of her head. And she was almost expelled for that, if I'm correct. Also in 1966, James Nabrett writes an essay in the Washington Post about increasing white enrollment at Howard University. Students still feel great about that.
Yeah.
1967, Nathan Hare, sociology professor, one of the founders of Black Studies, was fired from Howard University. And just one more. There were protests throughout spring semester of 1967, particularly in May, where a group of students occupied President Nabrett's office. I'm just thinking about setting the stage for 68. Pick up on any one of those and even add some to it as precursors to 68.
Obviously, the non-permed hair conversation even continued with color. And one of the projects that I know Jennifer Thomas worked on when she was a Moorland-Spingarn fellow a couple of years ago was permed hair was one thing, but then you also had color issues, which I think were not as straightforward as we might think. And I was trying not to use the straight as the pun, right? But to really think about what identity markers people valued either subconsciously or intentionally, and the work that had to be done to break consciousness. Jules Harrell tells us all the time and talks about like the saturation. The saturation is so deep and so real that it takes a 66, a 67, a 68, and then later on 68, 69 for it even to continue. We talk about that 68 moment, but then when the fine arts students take over and insist on having a meeting with Warner Lawson, it just doesn't stop. So it's important to think about that in the context of what's happening in the world today, because somehow we think because we have a 6-month break in where we got to struggle, that the world is on fire. The world's always been on fire for Black people.
Yeah, and we've always responded
That's
in
right.
ways that reflect the larger group,
Yep.
not just the people at the universities. I mean, you talk about Zora Neale Hurston in the 20s, I think about somebody like Ophelia Settle Egypt, who's helping Charles Johnson at Fisk when they are collecting the narratives of formerly captive Africans. Not talking about the Works Progress Administration, but the work of Black people talking to Black people, including Black students with Charles Johnson at Fisk in the 30s and 40s. And of course, that is the period where you see emerging Lorenzo Dow Turner trying to connect the Gullah Geechee language, doing global work there. William Leo Hansberry talking about classical Africa, in many ways on the periphery. And then, of course, the state gets involved and they drop $3 on Howard and they create an African Studies Center and exclude Hansberry. He gets his first trip to Egypt at that time. His daughter talks about that, Ms. Gale.
Yeah, they talk about University of Wisconsin being the first university to teach African history when, in fact, Leo Hansberry was doing it 20 years earlier here at Howard University.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think Journal of African American History with a long article on St. Clair Drake and puts that in the context, of course, Northwestern. They give them all the money, but they can't completely exclude Howard. So they give them a little bit of money and then they make sure that Hansberry doesn't get the money because, again, they're trying to forestall the inevitable, which is this global solidarity through intellectual work that he represents. But by the 60s, that's impossible because we've had, as you know, in your scholarship work in particular, been the Pan-Africanist movement, the African independence movement, the Caribbean movement, the independence movement. I mean, a guy like Eric Williams, who was on this faculty for over a decade in economics, now he's the prime minister of Trinidad and Tobago. So you can't stop this
Domesticate.
movement.
That's right.
Yeah. And so by 67, when Nathan Hare goes to, and I think a key piece in this, which I think we should really spend a whole lot more time with in 67 and 68, is what was going on at Tuskegee. The good brother Brian Jones up at New York Public Library, his book, The Tuskegee Student Uprising, talks about in 1967, they had a meeting of the National Student Association at Tuskegee. Nathan Hare is at that meeting. Cortland Cox is down there, Mary Baraka, and then Leroy Jones was there. And you see them talking about this idea of creating a real Black university. That means something different in Tuskegee, Alabama, where they are saying, and Gwen Patton had a lot to do with this, the late Gwen Patton. It means something different at a place where you're saying, we're here because we are surrounded by the very people we say we want to be helping. And ultimately, they have no deep connection with this institution. And so that sensibility finds its way into the Howard conversation in 67 and 68. And of course, they run Nathan Hare off because, go ahead. Yeah.
Let's explain a little bit about Nathan Hare and his significance. Can you just a quick background on who he was, the Black scholar, and maybe let's get into why they had to fire him. Why they felt they had to fire him.
Indeed. We talk about Nathan Hare. We got to talk about his wife, Julia, the great Oklahomans, and Nathan Hare, who recently just made transition a little over a year ago. 2024. Yes, 24. And Hare, professional boxer, interestingly enough, social scientist by training, sociology. He was, along with Acton Lynch, who is still with us, by the way, just he celebrated his 90th and 91st birthday. But they were junior faculty at Howard, and Hare is exploring this question of Black social science. This is just on the lip of what emerges in Atlanta with the Institute of the Black World, and in some ways the northern outpost of the IBW, which is, of course, the Institute for the Arts and Humanities. And Hare is interested in the relevance of Black universities to Black people. And that causes problems. He's part of that student protest and faculty protest, and not a lot of faculty who are joining him in that. There are not a lot of students. You mentioned the law school, for example. Those pushbacks were led often by a mix of student and faculty, including white faculty members. Hare is not fired as much as his contract is not renewed. And he ends up in 1968 as part of, talking about student movements, the student movement in San Francisco State, where they run off the president. What's the guy's name? Hayakawa, I think. Yeah, that's his name. And Ishmael Reed writes about him in Japanese by Spring, the fictional account. And they demand a kind of third world studies program, ethnic studies formation with Black studies and indigenous studies and Asian studies. And so Nathan Hare goes out there and creates the first program in Black studies, which would have been here had we been able to get over the thing that persists to this day, which is the deep tensions of class and the unwillingness to confront the reality that there are some people for whom the dream is not Black liberation and Black progress as a whole, but just make sure that 12% of the 100% of the people who are going to make all the money are Black. It's a very DEI to Black liberation, and Nathan Hare ran flush up against it. And as he famously said, Hare was like, listen, I can throw this diploma away. I can go out here and box and make some money or pick cotton. I was the fastest cotton picker in Oklahoma. I mean, that kind of sensibility doesn't tend to persist. In fact, you'd probably be more comfortable at a white school where you can kind of be looked at as a kind of anomaly or a zoo kind of exhibit or something. But in the Black HBCUs, no, sir.
Yeah, let's get into what it meant to strive toward a Black university. A lot of the students were writing at the time, and the Hilltop is a great resource for this. You can get the Hilltop on Digital Howard online, all of them from 1924 all the way to the present. You can get those on Digital Howard. A lot of the students are writing at the time that they're frustrated that they see Howard, again, this idea of the Black Harvard, which people still say, which I think is ridiculous. It's insulting to us and racist. But they're frustrated at Howard, as they see it, is a place where you train to enter white society, to fill slots in corporate America or other aspects of white society. What were they striving for toward a Black university? What did it mean to be a Black university in their eyes? Talk about community, which is very important, right?
Yeah, I think there've always been two Howards, at least two. One that was definitely interested in class and a Black version of whatever else was happening in the rest of the world. And then another segment that was interested in the liberation of Black people at the community level and all over the world. I think that still persists even now. the challenge has always been finding a home and making a home for those folks who are trying to do the work, and to have them find ways to be engaged in community, but also being in the space, because you can't serve community especially well without awareness of what the world was and is. And as Du Bois noted, like the broad sympathy, your relation to the world, you put yourself at the center, but you got to understand the whole thing. And the challenge that I think that we're facing now is people who have that kind of investment and that interest, but are of a generation that's less committed to understanding it in the full context of how it has happened over the years. And that's the work that we have to do as faculty. That's our primary work, to ensure that they are aware of the conversations that they see as new. And you can't blame them for it, in the sense that they only know what they know, but there has to be the opportunity for them to use the university as a space that moves community towards liberation.
Yeah.
And that's been something of a conflict.
We're frustrated. When I was at Howard in the 90s, early 90s, and Moorland-Spingarn Research Center was here. The African American Resource Center was here, same building, right? One's on the first floor, one's on the third floor.
Mhm.
But we're frustrated as I'm walking across campus with my friends on our way to the African American Resource Center, on our way to Moorland, and most people weren't very much interested in that, right? We talk about these two different populations, those who are interested in liberation, those who are interested in other aspects of the university. But it's not just Howard, right? I'm sure, Greg, I'm at Tennessee State, experiencing the same thing. My friends from Hampton and Morehouse. There's always that tension, isn't there, at our schools? Because, as you say, Dana, people have to be taught to it. They have to be brought to it.
Yeah, and you have to, I mean, you come to the world with it or not. You get socialized into it or not. And then your instinct tells you to go for it or not. Like, it was certainly the case at Grambling. Like, I gravitated towards the people who had a liberation impulse, even as they didn't have like a sign up saying, I'm trying to be free. I was just like, oh, I look like over there, like that person trying to do something. Let me go over there. But I was often going over there by myself or with like a certain group of folks, and that becomes your tribe. That's the kind of shorthand for what you say is your tribe. We want to try to make sure that students at Howard can find their tribe, that it's easier for them to find it. They shouldn't have to stumble upon it. It should be really clear.
Absolutely. All right, let's get into IH. We talked about a number of things coming out of 68, African American Studies, Moorland-Spingarn Research Center, African American Resource Center, Jazz Studies. The idea is bringing Blackness into the curriculum. We've been doing it for a long time. First, African Studies program, Leo Hansberry teaching African history, but now we're trying to institutionalize it, right?
Yeah.
One of these is IAH. Let's talk about what IAH was and what made it significant and really representative of, or illustrative of the significance of this moment, late 1960s going into the 1970s.
So IH was the Institute for Arts and Humanities at Howard. And I think that we could kind of do three buckets of people, if you will, that are really significant. The chief presidency is significant because he does have the financial backing of a Republican government, which, it is what it is. But the money is there and it's available. And then you juxtapose that with the vision of an Andrew Billingsley, who's like, all right, I know what I need to do with this and I know what I can do this. So he's able to imagine a thing. And Stephen Henderson as the person who's able to vision it out, to institutionalize it, because it's really important. And I think it's also important to think about it from the perspective of its engagement with community, because it understood, like, we're going to do this at the university. There is this academic component that's degree granting, degree seeking, but then there also has to be a responsibility that we have to community. So the cast of characters overall with the Institute for Arts and Humanities is virtually a who's who of people who were doing that kind of work, importantly, from the staff itself to the advisory committee, but ultimately the center itself or the institute itself was intended to help African people everywhere essentially understand what it meant to be in community with each other. It was never Howard-centered. It was always outward facing. And I think it was one of the best moments where we see the university say, we're going to use our resources to do work on behalf of or in service to and in community with Black people.
I would agree. I'd say, as Dr. Billingsley was saying, he'll be 100 in March 26th. So still
with
swinging
a
both
sharp
sticks.
mind. Exactly. With a mind sharp as a 20, now I'm going to say a 30-year-old, because all 20-year-olds ain't that bright.
Exactly. He was just down at Spelman. In fact, I just came back from Atlanta having that conversation about What Dr. Billings was talking about, as you say, Cheek, they have a moment, they have a window. Cheek comes in wearing dashikis and afros and walking around with African canes. And the students want a Black university. They want to be relevant to the Black community. In 68, you see the same thing in Atlanta. After the killing of Martin Luther King, the students come together at the Atlanta University Center and say, we need to change the name of this whole thing to the Martin Luther King University. That doesn't work, of course. And there's still some people around to tell the tale. Then Gerald McWhorter, who's on faculty there, now Abdullah Kalamat, talks about that. And in that work, Mrs. King establishes the Martin Luther King Center and asks Vincent Harding, who's teaching at Spelman, Stephen Henderson's at Morehouse at the time, to come run it. And they're doing a good job, but then they begin to part ways around the question of the use of violence or nonviolence. So what Harding does is get together with Stephen Henderson, Bill Strickland. These are the three major figures, and they create something called the Institute of the Black World. And you see Alton Davis involved, Maynard Jackson, Sterling Stuckey, Lerone Bennett, all them. And then you see others involved, junior folk who come in as apprentices and really take off. People like Janetta Cole and Joyce Ladner. And at a critical moment, Billingsley, who's out at Cal Berkeley at the time, is going to come to Atlanta to join the Institute of the Black World. He brought students out there, for example. That's where he meets Joyce Ladner for a summer thing. And then he gets the call from Cheek, because Cheek is like, we got to make a Black university. And he diverts and changes his plans. And he comes to DC and he brings that here. Cheek is like, there should be HBCUs in the North. At one time, Billingsley said he wanted Shaw, which is where Cheek came from, of course, president there, Shaw to have branch campuses all over the North. He laughs about that. But failing that, the Institute for the Arts and Humanities comes into existence in part because the IBW is losing funding and financial support. So they're encouraging, Howard Dotson at the time was running the IBW as an administrator, but you got to get these people off the payroll. So Henderson comes here in part because he can take a faculty position. Billingsley also hires Joyce Ladner, a junior, remember her Death of White Sociology, of course, comes out. Ron Walters and all. We covered all this, a great book that Paul Coates published that was edited by Charles Jarman, who used to be in sociology and associate dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. We did a festskrift of sorts for Andrew Billingsley, and Dana participated in that, particularly around the humanities and grappling with this question. And we brought back as many people from that period as possible. These many PhD programs that were started, all of this with the idea of having a Black university. And so finally, that question, which remains unresolved, really, as Billingsley said, his idea was, at least we said, Cheek said to him, we want the whole university to be African American Studies. Well, that wasn't going to work. So they established an African American Studies program in 69, and a guy who was teaching at Federal City College comes over ultimately to run it, Russell Adams. And Stephen Henderson finds his faculty appointment in African American Studies. In fact, if you look at Black Saturation, the recently published book with his writings, the selected syllabi that he is teaching at Howard, they're all in the African American Studies department. But they aren't wedded to any particular discipline as such. They want the whole institution to embrace Blackness. And that is simply something that the American Negro is not equipped to do, brother.
The institution and the community, because importantly, the workshop program was not for Howard students. It was for anybody in the community. The action-centered seminar program, external. The fellowship program, external. So it was like, we want both in and out. And you had to build the infrastructure to make sure that they couldn't mess it up. that the university couldn't mess it up. So it was, and even the documentation program, the kind of presence of mind to understand that we need to document and preserve everything was just like critically important, because the things that Howard wouldn't do, they still went out and taped. So I was just flipping through the catalog and I saw, as we were talking about South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement, at a time when the U.S. was completely on board, making no comments whatsoever, we see a number of conversations at IAH going out to make sure that they are documented. Hugh Masekela, everywhere he was, IAH was there. There was a anti-apartheid rally and conversation and lecture series that they taped. So it wasn't just Howard.
No.
Which we could keep saying all along, that it was there, but then there's this window. And I think the idea that you have been around Howard as this window is interesting in this way, because it's intentionally like outward looking as opposed to we're the center. It's just like we're looking out.
That's right. And we, in fact, I'm glad you raised that, Dana, because as we know, but the listeners need to understand that we continue to fight that fight to really, in many ways, invert the relationship of any university, certainly HBCU, to the community. We're not here to be the center. We're here to be extensions, at least theoretically. And that, of course, that fails because what that Black university concept does is expose the fact that universities are not set up to represent communities, but to manage them, to create that manager class, as you say. And so, what was it about 2016, 2017? We wrote a grant to NEH, and we said we need to preserve these documents and bring together folk who are the necessary, committed, full-throated heirs, next gens to that vision. And so we brought together HBC faculty from around the country here at Howard, and we digitized some of the recordings. I mean, you remember, of course, we're sitting there listening to Tony Cade, and we all are water welling up in our eyes as we see the good brother Hoyt Fuller, who has had Black world snatched out from under him from external pressure on his way to Atlanta, where he won't live long, receiving an award at the IEH. And, we had those conversations with folk from Morehouse and Winston-Salem State and Clark, Atlanta, just an amazing moment. And so I think one of the challenges we have here at Howard and everywhere, frankly, certainly HBCUs, I just saw it, as I said, it was at the AUC last week, is institutional memory. And without institutional memory, we continue to move away from the concept of genealogy, the concept of continuity. And so what we end up doing is looking more and more like these very white universities that Billingsley and Cheek and them were trying to move away from. And so, what distinguishes Howard or Morehouse, what distinguishes Spelman or any of our schools from a white school, if it's going to be a place where you're simply slotting people in to assume their role as a manager class? That's the challenge right now.
And I don't want to say that this experiment that began in 68, and when did it close out? Last close out about 83, the IAH?
Yeah, IH, the final report is 84, but they're done with their work essentially in 83. They just haven't done the final report.
And really, would you agree that they're going against the very idea of what a university is?
Yep, the concept of what an American or a European university is. I mean, Greg could tell you much better than I could. Like, it is completely in line, lockstep with the original idea of a university, the first iterations that we see on the continent.
And we see now this obsession with, still, it drives me crazy, rankings. Howard University, Spelman, Morehouse looking to U.S. News and World Report or Forbes to tell them where they stand in the world.
Yeah, and we said, Rep, don't get it wrong. Like, I've been in the chats, like, arguing with people about, like, all kinds of things with my main thing saying, like, my bread and butter, my heart, my foundation is Grambling, but still, like, FAMU, Hampton, okay. Like, let's talk about what's happening at these state schools. Yeah.
We can go on about 20 minutes on this one, or maybe even an hour, but I think it's kind of racist to say because you don't compare Harvard and Swarthmore.
Right.
Would you ever put Smith and Yale on the same top schools list? That just wouldn't happen. Spelman and Howard are fundamentally different universities, similar missions, but in terms of the structure and functioning and student body are different.
How are they different, would you say?
So if you say Howard is number 2 and Spelman is number 1, and what's the criteria? They're saying graduation rates, acceptance rates. I don't know what else.
Retention GPA, but we know, like, by and large, it's reputational. Yeah,
right.
But, like, one's a liberal arts women's college, and one is a, like, kind of more comprehensive university setting. So,
but different experience. You're in Washington, D.C., right? We have federal appropriations, research universities. So, in theory, a slightly different academic mission. Spelman is all women in the capital of the South, Atlanta. It's much smaller. So your experience as Spelman, although I think, the mission's centered on people of African descent, that's that shared constituency. But in terms of the structures of the university and the college, we have 14. I wouldn't say I don't like the rankings because it suggests that one is better than the other.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I think Tuskegee is an important institution. If it's number 14, I think that's ridiculous. Who cares about the ranking, right?
It's like Jacob Carruthers was saying, shout out to Houston-Tillotson University. That's where Dr. Carruthers went to school, because they just got $150 million. They're getting ready to do some transformative things down there. And of course, money plays a role. But as he used to say, when you come in these spaces, again, class plays that serious role. And, I like to say, I was down there with one of your old school comrades and colleagues, Ben and Morehouse, Ilya Davis, who runs the first year and senior programs in Morehouse.
He's doing a tremendous job down there at Morehouse.
incredible job, man. And Ilya and I was standing there right past the grave of Benjamin and Sadie Mays, and we're watching these young people go down into the valley for something they call, I forget what it is. It's a Wednesday gathering, they call it. It's like a midweek break. They have music and food. And I'm seeing all these women going. I said, where are these women coming from? He said, they come from Spelman and Clark. Morse Brown is still open, by the way, y'all.
Mhm.
And so while, yes, Spelman is behind a fence, they take classes at the other places.
That's right.
And every young man who comes up and introduces himself, young woman, Ilya's introducing me, I'm meeting them. Where you from? From Detroit. We Cass Tech Renaissance. I went to Cass. Okay, where you from? From Chicago. Went to Quincy Young. My whole thing is there is one HBCU with 107 locations. I don't make a distinction between any of them, quite frankly. And what Dr. Carruthers would call an ordinal classification in his little 1972 pamphlet, Science and Oppression, he would say what Western society does and what intellectuals in the West do, they want to create these categories and then they rank you with themselves always at the top. The real HU is in Cambridge. It doesn't have to call itself that. So the whole point is that the idea that we are competing for proximity to whiteness is at the heart of the HBCU project. The Black,
I don't think any of these schools should participate in these rankings.
I agree with you. And the minute you say that, here come all the trustees and college presidents to tell you get Ben Talton out to paint.
That's
My
fine.
point is this. No, it's fine until you got to pay your rent, brother. And this is what I'm saying. The Black university ultimately is really, I think, as a concept, a directive to put the Negro college out of business. That's a daunting task. And I think there are critical moments when we came close to having a point of entry to realizing something close to it. I think the IAH, in some ways, being an extension of the IBW, but we saw what happened to IBW. When Vincent Harding and Stephen Henderson and Bill Strickland and them said, we can't have a formal institutional relationship to the Atlanta University Center. We work there, we teach there, but this has to be separate. Why? Because the minute we enter that infrastructure, we are going to be pulled into the gravitational pull into this apparatus that we're trying to, if not dismantle, certainly create an alternative to. And so the IAH, I think, for a moment in time, and Dana talked about this, we sat there, all of us sat there one summer and not only watched the tapes from the period, we interviewed people like James Early. You know, we interviewed people like Harold Burke. We interviewed people like Andrew Billingsley, who took us through the challenges and then put it in the context of today. I think ultimately now we're at a point now where we see HBCUs aspiring to the type of academic practice that I think the people who were there in 68 and 69, 70, even as we bring them back to interview them and talk with them, would say, this is not what we were talking about. It's the challenge.
It is.
I love this idea of one university with many campuses.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that idea. We are far from that. Even around the conversations we're having today around AI and resources. Ilya Davis, who we just mentioned, he speaks in that similar vein to say that this is one university system or college system. And he said, listen, I'm at Morehouse and I can see that Howard is the flagship school. Most well-resourced in the nation's capital. People could disagree with that, but he's conceiving of these schools in the same way that you are.
Those conversations with the elders who were trying to do something different in full disclosure, they're also saying it was not what we intended, but we also don't yet have the alternative. That's for y'all to work out and for us to help you work out without starting from scratch. And that's kind of the work that we're trying to do ultimately, as we are also dispersed and get distracted. And then you got other identity problems. All universities have identity problems, I think, just in terms of who they want to be at a given moment. That depends on who the faculty is, who the students are, what the economic outlook is, like all of those things. And then the draw is a little bit different. Obviously, when integration ends, or that might have been Freudian, when segregation ends and you have the disbursement of the faculty, it's a little more complicated because then the people who get recruited into the space more contemporarily don't have the same idea of what the space is and can be. They are bringing over with them ideas of whiteness that don't necessarily, or certainly West and academy, that don't jive with what some of the folks who have been on the ground a little bit longer and it's just a different mission. Like, people are attracted to the space for different reasons. So there's that part. And I think that is our responsibility. And what we all tell our students, I know from having been in the space with all of us, is this isn't your responsibility. This isn't a thing that we're handing off to you. You are now co-workers with us and trying to figure this out. Like that notion of a bridge, no, like this isn't over. We're still in it as long as we are alive. And I can appreciate that. As long as we're alive, we don't abdicate our responsibility to say, well, we've done our part, it's for you to figure out. That's not how we have to move. So we have to find ways to build community, even with the young people and the people outside of the space, to think about what the world needs. Because when I think about what a university should do and be, I'm always returning to my father, who's like kind of running joke line was, look like to me, they ought to be able to figure that out at fill in the blank. If it was rural Black America, it was look like to me, they ought to be able to figure that out at Grambling. If it was a civil engineering problem, we trying to figure out how to get some roads and some spaces, look like to me, they ought to be able to figure that out at Southern. And then by the time I came to Howard, he did expand his kind of view. Because remember, people in the South, that's their world. Like they're thinking like them people at Howard, I don't know what they're doing. But he would say, look like to me, we got to be able to figure out this wealth inequality thing at Howard. Look like to me, y'all ought to be able to figure this out. So my view of what the Black university should be able to do was always, it originated in my father's genuine belief that Black colleges could solve problems. Like the fact that we don't have clean running water all the time in certain places, look like to me, we ought to be able to figure that out in a Black space, right?
Yeah.
So both of you were central to organizing a conference in 2010, isn't that right? Here at Moorland-Spingarn Research Center. Can you speak about that, some of the goals of that conference and the outcomes? What was at the center of it?
Well, if this were a movie, you would see us all, we were department chairs at the time, Daniels and English and African American Studies. We were in the Dean's conference room, Dean James Donaldson, the legend, still Dean. And the students there'd been an article in the Hilltop. And like you said, you can now see it digitally thanks to you and your staff. The students had talked with Thomas Battle, who was the MSRC director at the time, and they were like, what's going on with Moorland? The budget being cut, what's going on? And they were in an uproar. So we were in the chairs meeting and we decided we need to do something about that. So we put together a conference and it was called Preservation as Practice on the Moorland-Spingarn Center. And it was the time Sidney Ribaud, the 16th president, had called together something called the President's Commission on Academic Renewal. And he folded that into that work. In other words, what does it take to reimagine Howard? He's very, very faculty centered. So we had Dean Donaldson opened the conference. Gerald Horn came in to speak. Jesse Carney Smith, Karen Jefferson came from Woodruff, and Angel Baptiste, who was working at the Library of Congress over African and Middle Eastern Division. And then the faculty in the college, many of them chairs, told the history of the disciplines through Moorland. And so we had every discipline covered.
It was just exactly as you have described it. We tried to cover all the disciplines to make clear what would happen if there's no Moorland.
Yes.
Here from every discipline. So Dean Donaldson talked about mathematics and the holdings that were in mathematics. And this is actually how I really began to do some serious work on the Institute for Arts and Humanities, just trying to figure out like what are the humanities at Howard without the Institute. And so trying to get some direction from Joellen El-Bashir about like, here's the things that we're trying to do. I had done plenty of work on the Howard Players, but then thinking about what the Institute's like. And then, as you said, Karen Jefferson comes in and talks about South Africa and Howard's history and how it has been chronicled both at Moorland, but at other Black universities. So it was exactly what we're describing in terms of what's at Moorland, but what is the practice of preservation? Why is that so important at all HBCUs? How do we begin to have those conversations? And it was really following that conference and the impetus and the understanding of that we saw the move from students' hours being cut at Moorland being open only 3 days out of the week for 20 hours instead of for the full time. And the kind of crazy thing where external researchers who are trying to complete their book projects aren't able to do so because they literally can't get in the reading room. And ultimately, the hire of a full-time director, again, as Dr. Battle was beginning to move towards retirement and really staffing up. All of that comes out as a function of an awareness of how important the space was, because it is easy for a university to forget its treasure.
I love this history that this podcast, you all basically are the germ for this podcast, because it's a sneaky way of showing how significant Moorland is.
Yeah.
No question.
If we use the archival collections as a way of telling the story of the College of Fine Arts in jazz studies and dance studies, use our archival collections to talk about the significance of protest, as we're talking about today, or even the history of the Black presidency at Howard, or the anti-apartheid movement at Howard University, right? The impetus was really, how do we tell Howard's story? to Howard students, but then also to the world. So as I began with, I conceive of Howard as a window into America and to the world, but also, as Greg is saying, though, we also have to view Howard from a different angle as well. Howard, we can't just center Howard all the time. So one of the ways that we want to approach this is to center and decenter Howard. But we really want to tell Howard's story. So in these upcoming episodes, we're going to talk about Albert Cassell, for example, African-American architect who designed 3 iconic buildings on Howard's campus: Founders Library, Frederick Douglass Hall, and the Chemistry Building. But it's not just about Howard Cassell. It's about historic sites and commemoration, right, as part of the global Black experience. How do we remember, right? I was listening to a podcast. They're talking about historic Black sites in D.C., and they mentioned everything but Howard University. So we want to have an episode that talks about Howard as a historic site. We also want to talk about the legacy of white presidents at HBCUs and what that history meant. But we're going to use the story of Mordecai Johnson, Howard's first president, came in 1926. Baptist minister, one of the most sought-after orators of the mid-20th century, mentor to Benjamin Mays, who was a mentor to Dr. King. So use him as a window into America and into the world. We're also going to talk about Zora Neale Hurston, talk about Lucy Diggs Slowe. Mm-hmm. Lucy Diggs Slowe was the first African-American woman dean of any university in the country. A dean of women here at Howard University, also professional tennis player, won the first WTA championship when they opened it up to women, also founder of AKA Sorority Incorporated. Some of you might be familiar with AKA. Yeah. She was also openly queer in a time before there was such a word as queer, and lived down the street from campus with her partner. So again, we want to use Howard's history, iconic events, moments, and individuals as a window into broader subjects that have shaped the global Black experience. That's our goal. And I think we're off to a good start with you all. I thank you for joining us on this inaugural episode. You can follow Moorland on Instagram at Moorland, MOORLANDHU on Instagram. And look forward to more episodes on The Yard. Thank you all.
Appreciate you, Ben. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you for joining us on The Yard, the podcast of the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center, a University FM production, and produced by MSRC's very own Aaron Jacobs. I am Dr. Benjamin Talton. We look forward to seeing you again on The Yard.